We will now carry out a greenhouse gas applicability exercise in which you will determine whether PSD applies to an example source. In this example, Hard Rock is an existing manufacturing facility with the following emission sources of greenhouse gases: boilers, emergency generators, space heaters, process heaters, and thermal oxidizers. Assume that the permitting of the proposed modification will be completed after July 1st, 2011. So it will be part of the step 2 of the tailoring rule. And also assume that they will commence construction of the proposed modification on August 1st, 2012. Further, the facility's current GHG emissions are in excess of 100,000 tons per year of CO2e. Also assume there are no debottlenecking issues associated with the pending modification. Because the dominant component of the greenhouse gas emissions is CO2, it is reasonable to assume that the CO2e limits, rather than the mass-based limits, will be controlling from a standpoint of triggering PSD. Therefore, this example will only deal with the CO2e emissions. Obviously, in a rigorous application or an applicability exercise, one would have to do both the mass-based and the CO2e-based calculations and include all the GHGs. However, we're doing this for simplicity for this exercise. All right, Hard Rock's modification has 3 components. They will add a new gas-fired boiler with distillate oil backup. Hard Rock proposes to limit the backup fuel use to 500 hours per year. Hard Rock will also be adding 2 new diesel-fired emergency generators, both of which will have their use limited to 500 hours per year. And Hard Rock is removing from service an old coal-fired stoker boiler. Now, I won't read out all the emissions that are listed here, but they're shown on this slide, and I'll just give the reader a chance to look through these, and then we'll move on in about 10 seconds. Okay, the stoker boiler that is being shut down has a maximum capacity of 300 million BTUs per hour and a maximum operating schedule of 24 hours per day, 365 days per year. So it has no limitation on the amount of hours on a yearly basis. And looking back over the last 10 years, this boiler operated on average 320 days per year over the last 2 years with the highest usage. That would be at an average rate of 195 million BTUs per hour. The boiler has CO2 emission rates, and these are shown on this slide. Okay, Hard Rock believes that the PSD review for the greenhouse gases is not required for this project, since the emission reductions that are caused by the shutdown of the stoker boiler will mean that the project has an increase in CO2e that is below the significance threshold. With the figures we have provided, what is your assessment? If you are not able to decide, what other information may be needed in order to arrive at a conclusion? And I'll move forward in about 10 seconds. Okay, for this, we do not know enough to determine whether PSD is triggered. The project on its own has an increase which is above the threshold of 75,000 tons per year, which would be the threshold for a modification in step 2 of the tailoring rule. And you can see the emission levels here, everything added together, all the new increases would be over 200,000 tons per year of CO2e. So the reduction that's due to the shutdown in the stoker boiler is not going to be included in this step. It will not be included until the contemporaneous netting period, the evaluation of the increases and decreases that are credible during that period. Okay, so let's just review the key points of the exercise up to this point. First of all, when determining the emissions associated with a project, choose the worst case scenario. In this case, firing the distillate oil for up to 500 hours per year increases emissions over the level when firing just gas only. So the assessment would include 500 hours of distillate use and then 8260 hours of gas use. That's the balance of what you would have if you had no enforceable restrictions on the amount of hours within a year. Secondly, at this step, you would sum the emissions of the units that only are having increases, emission increases. Do not count any decreases from emission units, even within the project, until a contemporaneous netting period evaluation is done. Thirdly, if not provided by the applicant, request information on all of the increases and decreases that have occurred during the contemporaneous period before you start the netting calculation for those pollutants that exceed the significant emission thresholds at the first step. Okay, assuming you did request that additional information, Hard Rock submits the information that's on some of the previous changes that have occurred at the facility. There are 3 actions that they presented that you should consider. Process heater that was shut down, and as you see that was shut down in July 2007. A thermal oxidizer was shut down in September 2007. And then a new building with an associated gas-fired space heating equipment was added in October 2007. And as you see, the potential greenhouse gas emissions on a CO2e basis are shown for each of those. Assume that the beginning of the contemporaneous period is 5 years before the construction commences, which is a federal contemporaneous period. Also assume the previous changes have not been relied upon in any past PSD permitting action. Okay, now we come to a step for the reader to take a chance. Is Hard Rock subject to PSD for these greenhouse gases? And I will move forward in 10 seconds. Okay, here shows the math for the Hard Rock example. Let's go over the numbers. So the increase from the project, as we mentioned before, was over 200,000 tons per year of CO2e, 226,990 tons per year to be exact. All right, so then the amount of emissions on actual basis for the Stoker boiler, as you see, is 153,830 tons per year. The new heaters need to be considered at their potential to emit for an increase in 5,000 tons per year. And then the RTO removal is considered with its actual emissions of 2,550 tons per year. The reduction due to the process heater is not included because it is outside the contemporaneous period. So we end up with an increase that is just over the 75,000 tons per year threshold. Hard Rock still has options to limit the emissions in a manner that will keep the project out of PSD. Obviously, PSD does apply based on the emissions we just went over. So what are the types of changes that Hard Rock could propose that would actually eliminate the possibility of PSD applicability for the greenhouse gas emissions? And I'll move forward in 10 seconds. Okay, here we show a few options that Hard Rock could use to eliminate triggering PSD. Hard Rock could eliminate or greatly reduce the use of distillate for backup fuel, but that would need to be an enforceable limit. Hard Rock could also take enforceable limits on the operating hours or the fuel use and the emissions of the new boiler. And Hard Rock could start construction earlier. This would actually bring into the contemporaneous period the reduction from the shutting down of the process heater that would reduce the net emissions increase to less than 75,000 tons per year, therefore not triggering PSD. Okay, in this slide we just summarize some of the key points of the second part of the Hard Rock exercise. First, one should use the actual emissions from the units being shut down and use the potential emissions from new units that are added during the contemporaneous period when doing the netting calculation. Also, double-check the dates of all increases and decreases to ensure that those being considered are really contemporaneous. The shutdown of the process heaters in July 2007 was not within the contemporaneous period and therefore could not be used in the netting calculation. Also, confirm whether contemporaneous increases and decreases have been relied upon in a previous PSD permitting action. If they have, they are not to be included in another action. Note that if a netting analysis results in a source avoiding PSD for a specific pollutant, EPA does not consider that reduction to necessarily have been relied upon and could potentially be used in a future netting analysis. Lastly, it is important to remember that the permitting applicant can take enforceable limits on the emissions of the new or modified units to drop below the significance level. In this case, the applicant could limit the hours of operation of the new boiler, its fuel firing rate, the amount of distillate used, or a combination of these actions to reduce the project emissions and to successfully net out. And this concludes the PSD applicability exercise.